All right, welcome back. And for this video, we're going to be looking at the consequentialist ethic of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. And in the last video, we looked at egoism, the notion that one ought to always look out for one's own self-interest. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethic, like egoism is. However, utilitarianism takes a little bit of a different approach. Utilitarianism believes that one ought to always act in such a way so as to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. One ought to always act in such a way so as to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, utilitarianism believes that the best kind of society would be that would make sure to be able to provide for everyone. However, it realizes that that's sort of idealistic and that that's not really possible. And so basically what we should do, instead of, if we can't make everybody happy, if we can't provide for the interest of everyone, then what we ought to do is at least try to look out for the interest of the majority, of the most people that we possibly can. So the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, so it recognizes that nothing's going to benefit everybody. So the next best thing is to simply benefit the majority. It should be noted that utilitarianism is an altruistic ethic. Altruistic. Now, you'll recall altruism is the idea that we ought to expend our time and energy and effort in order to benefit others. That we should benefit others even at the expense of ourselves. So that's altruism. Now, how is utilitarianism an altruistic ethic? Well, it calls us to do whatever, to take action in order to benefit the majority of people. But it's very possible that we might find ourselves in the minority position. But even if we do find ourselves in the minority position, we are still called upon to do whatever it takes to benefit the majority. So that's why this is an altruistic ethic. It calls for us, even at some points, not all the time, certainly, but at some points it may call upon us to sacrifice some value of our own so that the majority of people might be benefited. So that's an altruistic ethic. It tells us to look out for the benefit of the majority, even if we are in the minority in that particular situation. Utilitarianism may form a foundation for part of American civil government. When we go to vote on things, for example, when they have elections here, we'll go vote for a person to represent us. And the way that person is, it is determined whether that person won or not depends upon how many votes they got. And so the majority rules. The majority carries the day. Also, when our representatives in either house or whatnot, either chamber, when our representatives are making law, the way that they determine whether a bill becomes a law, in very rough form. But anyway, they're going to vote on it at some point, and the majority is going to carry that vote. And even if the executive branch vetoes that law or that bill, it can be overridden if the majority is sufficient enough from the elected representatives. So majority rule is sort of it's one aspect of American civil government. Of course, American civil government is not founded completely on majority rule, but it is a factor there. Okay, two thinkers we want to look at under utilitarianism. The first one is a guy by the name of Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham is kind of an interesting guy, but anyhow, he's kind of in his day, he's kind of a rock star philosopher. He's a very charismatic guy, very, very intelligent man. He wrote widely on a number of different topics, not only utilitarianism, but also education, educational theory, things like this. But his ethic is utilitarianism, and in his day, he announced ahead of time that the next book that he was going to write was going to be the end book for all, the last book that is necessary in the realm of ethics. And so he had quite a following, and there was a lot of expectation for this. Well, when he let his book come out and be published, To say that it was sort of a letdown, with the exception of those who are his sort of dyed-in-the-wool fans, to say that it was a letdown is an understatement. Bentham's critics basically tore it to pieces. They called it a pig philosophy, which we'll see why that is in a minute. But anyway, his book expounded on a version of utilitarianism, the idea that one should always do what is in the greatest good for the greatest number. One should always do what is in the best interest for the greatest number, promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. But when you say something like one should always do what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, there's two things that need to be clarified. What do you mean by good, and what do you mean by greatest? If we're talking about greatest good for the greatest number, what do you mean by greatest? What do you mean by good? Well, for good, Bentham, as we had talked about in the previous video, Bentham was a hedonist. He believed, and one of the things he's well known for saying is that human beings have two sovereign masters that basically make them do whatever they do. They're sovereign masters. Are pleasure and pain. They act in order to pursue pleasure. They act also in order to avoid pain, according to Bentham. So good equals pleasure. But you might ask yourself, well, how is pleasure to be measured? And the answer to that question, Bentham would say that the greatest good would be the greatest quantity of pleasure. And so he measures greatest in terms of quantity. Now, this is what got him in trouble with his critics, because his critics are like, how do you measure quantity? How do you measure quantity of pleasure? Well, Bentham says the way that you do that is what you want to do is you want to quantify pleasure according to, and he called the unit of measurement of pleasure, he called that a hedon. And he says what you need to do is you need to think about 7 aspects of pleasure, and you need to assign them a number of hedons based on how a particular act is going to produce that pleasure. So when you're considering an act, what you do is you sit down with a piece of paper and you mark down these 7 categories. And in every one of these 7 categories, you want to rate this act as to what you can expect the amount of pleasure that will be produced by this act. And so what are those 7 he calls this, by the way, he calls this the hedonistic calculus. Hedonistic calculus. And this is a tool that Bentham develops in order to try to determine what act is going to produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. And so the seven aspects of pleasure that he talks about are these. The first one is intensity, and he notes that some pleasures are far more intense than others. For example, eating a Thanksgiving meal where you just sort of gouge yourself on turkey and mashed potatoes and everything else. Eating a Thanksgiving meal is a very intense pleasure. It feels great. You feel all warm inside. You feel like taking a nap, which, by the way, is also pleasurable. And so that's a great amount of pleasure, great intense pleasure. Whereas reading a book may not be as intense. Reading a book is just kind of laid back. You sit back there and you even if it's a really good book, the pleasure of it is less intense. But it might be longer lasting, but it's less intense. Well, that brings us to our next category, our next aspect of pleasure, and that is the duration of that pleasure. Whereas we can readily understand and acknowledge that some pleasures are more intense than others, also some pleasures last longer than others. And it may very well be that a pleasure that is not as intense but longer lasting might produce more pleasure than a pleasure that is intense but only lasts for a few moments, right? So just taking those 2 aspects of what it means for something to be pleasurable, we can readily see that just because something is intensely pleasurable doesn't mean that it's going to produce the most pleasure. So there's intensity, and then there's duration. Duration asks, how long will the pleasure last, right? Because eating a Thanksgiving dinner is a very intense pleasure, doesn't last that long. You're looking 2, 3, 4 hours later, you're ready for leftovers already, another piece of pumpkin pie or whatever it may be. The intensity of that fullness and that pleasure has gone away. Whereas if you're reading a book, that pleasure might last for a much longer duration, not only in the moment that you're reading it, but also later on as you're just thinking about how that was such a cool way in which that story was handled, and it gives you pleasure later on. So the intensity and duration, those are two categories of a hedonistic calculus. The next one would be that of certainty. How certain are you before you do the act that after you do the act, it will produce pleasure? You see, herein lies a major drawback for utilitarian ethics, and that is this. You're supposed to do an act which results in pleasure, but how do you know before you do the act that the consequence of the act is actually going to be what you expect? How do you know when you're doing it or before you do it that when you do the act that it actually is going to turn out like you think it is? Because I mean, let's face it, we've all been in situations where we had planned to do something and it didn't exactly pan out the way we wanted. And we had the best of intentions going into doing whatever it was. But as we completed the act and as we, as you know, things just kind of fell apart. They fell to pieces. And Bentham says, look, you've got to be absolutely certain that this act is going to result in this consequence. This act is going to produce this pleasure. Because if you're not that certain, then the whole project is up in the air, right? So intention, duration, certainty. Excuse me. Propinquity is the next one. Now, this is not a word that we use a lot anymore, but propinquity is the notion that is the idea of delayed gratification, right? So how soon or how remote can we expect this act to produce this pleasure? For example, somebody might have surgery to remove a tumor, maybe a benign tumor that is causing them pain. And you know what? Surgery, it's not that pleasurable. But later on, after the recovery period is over, they're going to have increased range of motion. They're going to have, they're not going to have the constant pain and the nagging that tumor was produced. And so they're going to be pain-free. But that pain-freeness is a state that will exist a while from now after they've healed, right? It's remote. So what is, rather than maybe getting a shot just to numb the pain for this instant, that will do it very quickly, but in the long run, it's not going to help things in the long run. So how soon can you expect the pleasure or this pleasure to take place? That's what he calls propinquity. I think college students are all acquainted with the notion of delayed gratification, right? Because you're in college right now. And I mean, it would be easy right now just to go and see a movie or go to a party or whatever. But no, as a good college student, you've devoted yourself to studying and bearing down and making sure that you get the grade and working hard and this sort of thing. Why? Because you expect that after having done all of this, all of that is required in order to get the degree that you're pursuing, you expect that one day your gratification will be great, that this will pay off in the end. Now, and that's what you're hoping for. And so you're delaying gratification in hope for a greater amount of pleasure later on. So what is the remoteness or the nearness of this? He calls that the propinquity. So intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity. The next one is another one of these words that we don't use a whole lot anymore, and that is fecundity. Fecundity. And the fecundity of pleasure is this. The fecundity of pleasure is fecundity is a notion of reproduction. Usually that term is used mostly in animal husbandry today. Whether talking about the fecundity of certain animals and certain genes, strains of genes and stuff like that. The fecundity, the ability of this to be reproduced later on. I brought up the idea of a Thanksgiving dinner, and that's an intense, short-lived pleasure. Whereas if I'm reading a philosophy book, I might find that immediately painful. But ultimately, that might gain pleasure, and that pleasure might reproduce itself not only as I pass my exams and get a good grade and get my diploma, but it also might help me think through things later in life because of the categories that I learned in philosophy. And logic might help me think better and later in life and keep reproducing that and other kinds of pleasure later on in my life. So eating Thanksgiving dinner versus learning philosophy has the greater potential for the reproduction of pleasure later on. So fecundity, intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, and then purity. Purity, is the pleasure going to be pure, or is it going to be mixed with some sort of pain, some sort of harm, something like that? So purity, how pure can we expect the pleasure to be? And then lastly is that of extent. How many people will be affected by this act? How many people will it bring pleasure to? How many people does it stand the possibility of causing pain to? And those are all things that we need to take into consideration when we are considering whether we should do an act or not. And this is how we quantify pleasure on terms of intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. Those are the 7 different aspects of pleasure that Bentham would have us consider when we're asking how much pleasure that we'll have. Now, Bentham's critics saw this and they basically rolled their eyes and scoffed at it. They called it a pig philosophy. Now, why is that? Well, they said, with Bentham, it's very easy to imagine a situation where somebody could increase pleasure simply by seeking the pleasures of the flesh. For lack of a better term. So eating and drinking and sleeping and leisure and sex and all these sorts of things that bring people pleasure. So a person could devote themselves to the pursuit of those pleasures and reasonably expect that at the end of the day, their lives will have amounted to more pleasure than somebody who, let's say, pursued it in helping others and devoting themselves to their studies. Maybe they graduate college, and a week later they die. And they've never been able to accrue to themselves the pleasure that they wanted to. And so Bentham's critics are like, yeah, see, this is silly, because this would promote the idea that human beings are nothing more than pigs. Because a pig could be very easily pleased and have great amounts of pleasure simply by eating his fill of slop, which is basically leftovers, excreting himself in his mud, and then rolling in his feces and things like that, and then bathing himself in the sun, and he would be perfectly happy. Well, it's a pig philosophy. It focuses too much on it makes no distinction, rather, between the pursuits of the intellect and the pursuits of the flesh. So Bentham's critics were very harsh on him that way. Well, Bentham wasn't the last of the utilitarians, certainly. In fact, the next one that we'll talk about is that of John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill actually was a protege of Jeremy Bentham. I mentioned earlier that Bentham was kind of a rock star philosopher in his day, and he had kind of a little group following, groupies, that would gather around, and they paid attention to everything he said. They hung on every word. Well, among them was a man who, when Bentham came up with this new theory of education, this man said, look, why don't you try out your new theory of education on my son, little John here? And he's a very bright young boy, and he could use a good education. And if you teach him and he turns out well, you can show people that your theory of education works. So Bentham did that. He was a tutor and a tutor for John Stuart Mill. He basically educated him, and was a very rigorous training. I mean, Bentham put him through a lot. He learned several research languages by the time that he was like 12, 13 years old. He had known Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and various German research languages in addition to his own language. He had been able to read the classics and so forth. Anyway, so little John Stuart Mill was very intelligent, a brilliant young man. However, because of the intensity of his studies, in his teen years, John Stuart Mill undergoes a mental breakdown. And as a result, he does recover. And as a result, after he recovers, though, he begins to write, and he writes very prolifically. And he takes a lot of the theories of his teacher, Jeremy Bentham, and he basically he's going to modify them just a little bit, but he's pretty much in lockstep, other than that, with Bentham. Now, what does he do differently? Well, he does believe, he agrees with Bentham that the best ethic out there is utilitarian, is the principle of utility. And here's the reason. He justifies it on this basis. He says, look, if we're talking about what someone's human rights are, we don't know what rights are. Rights are something that's sort of in the atmosphere. They're ethereal. They're things that we can say that we have, but we can't see them. We can't touch them. We can't feel them. So we can't formulate an ethic based on human rights. Also, likewise, we can't tell for sure what human virtues are. What would be a character quality of excellence? Because virtues, while there may be a certain consensus on it, virtues basically are only good if they serve to promote human flourishing. And if they serve to promote human flourishing, then virtues should be subjugated to utility. Utilitarianism, however, is a theory that does produce visible consequences, because you can see that the consequences. You can measure them. You can tell them how they're going to be beneficial. Because of that, that's the reason we should go on the basis of utilitarianism. It's kind of an empirical ethic. You can see the effect that it's going to produce. Mill does differ with Bentham, however, in one respect, and that is this. He does agree that the good ought to be defined in terms of pleasure. However, he believes that rather than saying the greatest is determined by the greatest quantity, like Bentham did, he says that the greatest should be determined by the greatest quality of pleasure. He makes a distinction between mental pleasures and physical pleasures. And we can see this distinction, right? We can understand this kind of intuitively. Mental pleasures might be something like reading or writing. It might be studying or creating or something of that nature. Those are things that exercise our intellect as human beings. They engage that part of us that makes us human, our reason and our intellect, our ability to think. And so those are mental pleasures. He makes the distinction between mental pleasures and physical pleasures are pretty well understood. Physical pleasures could be things like eating, things like exercising, like sleeping, like sex. Those things which indulge that utilize our body in the doing of them. Those are physical pleasures. So there are mental pleasures and there are physical pleasures. Now, Mill labels physical pleasures lower pleasures, and he labels mental pleasures higher pleasures. Now, how do we justify naming physical pleasures lower and mental pleasures higher? Well, Mill believes that the reason that we do this is because, let's face it, he says, for everybody who is able to experience both kinds of pleasures, anybody who's able to experience both of them, they're going to inevitably agree that mental pleasures are higher pleasures. Now, this is sort of begging the question, right? Because what happens when somebody comes along and says, "Well, I can experience both of them, and I, for myself, prefer physical pleasures." Well, then Mill's going to say something along the lines of, well, see, the reason that you prefer physical pleasures is because while you might think that you can experience both, you really don't experience both. And so he's going to beg the question. He's going to believe, or he's going to say that no, that's not possible. Everybody who has a brain is going to choose mental pleasures. Of course, that's kind of a logical fallacy, but that's what Mill says. when he's asked why the mental pleasures are higher, physical pleasures are lower. Now, there is a problem here, and it wasn't as if Bentham didn't understand that there's a difference between physical and mental. But Bentham, John Mill's teacher Bentham, he believed and still chose quantity, because here's the problem with making a distinction between mental and physical, and then saying that mental pleasures are higher, physical pleasures are lower. Because if we're talking about the greatest good for the greatest number, right, that's it. So the greatest good in utilitarianism is supposed to be pleasure. But what Mill has done in making this distinction between the two is that he has created another form of measurement, a secondary form of measurement in the notion of what he calls the greatest good. So are we talking about the greatest good, or just the greatest good, right? So the greatest good would be mental pleasures, and just the greatest good would be physical pleasures. So in reality, what Mill has done is he has taken the notion of physical pleasures, which are a significant portion of pleasures, and he said, no, not these. The greatest good is actually the pursuit of mental pleasures, and he's made it all about that, when he himself should know that the pursuit of mental pleasures at the expense of everything else leads one to a mental breakdown. He experienced that in his life. But nonetheless, he does want to accentuate this distinction. He does want to accentuate that distinction. Now, I do want us to examine some critique of utilitarianism. And the reason being is because I think at first glance, especially because this is our culture's almost default setting, at first glance, this seems to be unquestionable. It seems to be self-evident. Everybody should work for the greatest good for the greatest number. So we live in a culture that values self-sacrifice. We live in a culture that believes that one should always work for the greater good. We'll use that kind of phrase. And that's what utilitarians are advocating, right? However, we may do so, we may advocate for those sorts of things in an uncritical way, and without examining them. And I want us to take a look at some critiques that people have offered toward utilitarianism that I think that need to be examined. So the first thing is this, and there's a philosopher named Philippa Foot who says, think about it along these lines. She proposes a thought experiment known as the trolley problem. And this is a rather famous or well-known thought experiment that people will talk about. I think it's been mentioned in books and movies and things like that. But here's the idea. She says, imagine yourself and you are a worker on the railroad, and your job is a switch operator. And you are to stand at this particular switch so that when the train comes by, if you want the train to continue on to the main line, you just leave the switch alone, right? So if you want it to go on the main line, you leave the switch alone. But if you need the train to go down the branch line, then you have to pull the switch. You see the train coming, this train needs to go down the branch line, you pull the switch, and it diverts the train down to the branch line. So that's your job. And so you're sitting there all day, every day, either leaving the switch alone and waving at the people as they pass, they go down the main line, or if it needs to go down the branch line, you pull the switch and you wave at the people as they go past and they go down the branch line. So that's what your job is. Well, in this particular day, you're sitting there, and you notice that on the main line down the road a little ways, or down the tracks a little ways, there's a crew doing some work to just check and make sure that everything's fine on the tracks. They're just putting spikes in or making sure that the railroad ties are nice and tight and secure. And so they're doing some maintenance on the track. There's five guys down there. And as you look down the branch line, and you see down the branch line there's also some work going on, but there's only one guy over there. He's doing some work. And neither of them, they're all doing railroad work, and so they're kind of they've got their earbuds in, and they're listening to some music and not really paying attention to what's going on. Well, come to find out, the 12 o'clock train is 20 minutes early. And you see the train coming down the track, and it comes around the bend, and there it sure enough is. And those guys are still on the tracks out there. There's 5 guys on the main line. There's 1 guy on the branch line. If you leave the switch alone, it's going to go down the train's going to go down the main line and run over 5 people. If you pull the switch, the train's going to go down the branch line and run over the 1 person. So what do you do? Well, what would the utilitarians say that you should do? Well, the utilitarian should say, well, we've got greatest good for the greatest number, right? And unfortunately, in this particular situation, there's no greater good. There's no good, but there's sort of a lesser evil, right? So what should you do? Should you leave the switch alone and plow over the 5 people? Should you take your hand, pull the switch, and your hand will be the one involved in bringing about the end of the life of the 1 person who's down there? What are you going to do? So the utilitarian would say, you've got no choice in the matter. You've got to take your hand, put it on that switch, and pull the switch, all the while knowing that every inch that you pull that switch brings that 1 guy on the track closer to death. So what do? The utilitarian says, look, pull the switch. Train goes down there, and it kills the guy on the track. Okay, that's a problem. Utilitarianism, one of the things that it might make you do is involve your very own hands with something that is horrible, that is atrocious, that otherwise we would think is a terrible thing. But situation may present itself that is such that if you don't do something terrible in the moment, then a worse evil will take place later on. This is sort of the justification for using torture in order to justify getting information out of somebody that information might save lives. And if I can save, let's say, I've got 5 platoons going into a combat zone, and there's an ambush that is coming, and this person knows where the ambush is. If I can torture this person to the extent where I get the information of where the ambush is going to be, I could save all of those men. So am I going to really forego torturing them in order to, and then have all of these men killed? Well, I need to get the information, so I put my hand to doing the horrible deed of torturing another human being, of inflicting pain on a defenseless human being so that I can find out the information that I need to preserve life. The ends justifies the means, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. However, what does that do to me? What does that make me? Well, that makes me the person who tortured that person, or in the case of the trolley problem, that makes me the person who pulled the switch that ended the life of that human being. So it might, utilitarianism might very well involve us doing something that normally would be considered horrible in order to pursue the greatest good for the greatest number. So that's one problem that it has. That's one critique. Another one can be seen if we switch the trolley problem just a little bit and think about the following scenario. Let's consider that same day you're there. There's 5 people working on the main line, and instead of it being a person on the branch line, you see a guy walking down the tracks, and he's got a white lab coat on, and he comes to you. And he says, and he's just looking happy and singing and kind of skipping, and you're like, "Hey, what's happening?" He's walking on the tracks. He says, "You know what?" He says, "Hi, my name is Dr. So-and-so," and he says, "I just got to tell you that I have found the cure for cancer. I found it. I know what it is. I figured it out. As I was walking along the tracks here, this one piece of research that I couldn't figure out before just fell into place. I know it's going to work, and as soon as I get back to the lab, I'm going to write it down, and we're going to have the cure for cancer. We're going to save millions of lives. This is great." And you're like, "Well, that's fantastic. I know that cancer is a terrible thing, and it's produced so much pain in people's lives. It's going to be a great thing to alleviate that." He says, "Yeah," and he goes skipping down the track toward the lab. Well, he takes the branch line, and he's walking along the branch line. 5 guys from the railroad on this side, one guy who claims to have the cure for cancer on this side. and here comes the train. Now what do? Do you let the train run over the 5 people, or do you pull the switch and let the train run over the 1 person? Well, in this case, the utilitarian would say, well, if that guy has the cure for cancer, then we've got to save his life, because 5 lives are a small price to pay. As bad as that is, would be a small price to pay if we could get the cure for cancer, right? So the utilitarian would say that, but here's the problem. How do you know that that guy in the white lab coat has the cure for cancer? How do you know? Are you certain that he has the cure for cancer? I mean, because whether you pull that switch or not, what you do with that switch is going to change things irrevocably. Are you absolutely certain that that guy was a research scientist looking for the cure of cancer who actually has it? Or maybe he was an escapee from the mental hospital who stole a lab coat so that he could get out. So how do you know? How are you certain before you commit to what you do with that switch? How are you certain that the outcome is going to be what you expect? And that's a major flaw in utilitarianism, and actually that's a major flaw for all consequentialist ethics. How can you know before you do the act that it will produce the consequence that you desire, whether egoistic or utilitarian? And that's you can't be 100% sure always. So that's always sort of a drawback to either utilitarianism or egoism. So there's that issue. But those probably aren't the most severe issues. Probably the worst one is this. If we modify the trolley problem one more time, we can see this. Well, this is one of the most. There are 2 more. But think about this. Think about, again, scenario. On the main line, you've got 5 guys down there working, and they're just plugging away and so forth. And the 1 person that is on the branch line is not another railroad worker and is not a research scientist that may be somebody else, but is your mother or your brother or sister or loved one, somebody that you care for as much as you care for yourself. Imagine that. Now what do? What would the utilitarian say to do? Well, the utilitarian would look at that and they would say, well, there are 5 people over here. These people are young people. They're laborers. They're workers. They've got a lot of life ahead of them. They have families, each one of them. They want to see their kids grow up. Their kids need to have their parents. Over here, you've got your mom, who you love very much. But let's face it, mom's getting up there in years. She doesn't have as much life left as the people over here do. And there's only 1 of her. There's not 5. Like there are over here. The utilitarian would say, I hate to say this to you, but the moral thing to do to promote the greatest good for the greatest number is to pull the switch and let the train run over mom. Well, here's a problem. Herein lies a problem with utilitarianism, and that is the problem of equality. Because as much as we think that equality might be a virtue, none of us treats everybody equal. I have 6 children. I feed my children. I clothe my children. I care for my children. I provide for my children. I don't do that for the children next door. Now, they're good kids and I love them. And if somebody were trying to harm them, I would step in and try to protect them. But I prefer my children over everybody else's children. And I think that every parent does. And we have this intuition within us that we should have the right to prefer our kids more than others. And so there's no equality in my mind when it comes to whose kids I like the best. Now maybe one day if I have grandchildren, I'll like them better than my kids. I don't know. I've been told that by some grandparents. But you understand what I'm saying. We believe, inherently, almost intuitively believe that people have a right to show preference to those that they want. Well, utilitarianism doesn't allow for that because everyone equals a 1. Everyone is equal. And if on the track we have the equivalent of 5 over here, and on the branch line we have the equivalent of 1 over here, it doesn't matter who or what that 1 is. It doesn't matter who or what the 5 is. the numbers are all equal, and so we simply have to go with what promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. So anyway, that's a pretty major drawback to this theory. Perhaps, however, the worst one is this, and it doesn't involve the trolley problem. Perhaps the worst one is this, the worst drawback to utilitarianism is this. It is that it does not have a basis for what we call unalienable rights. Utilitarianism does not provide a basis for unalienable rights. Now, John Stuart Mill recognized this right out of hand. And he, in fact, thought that we ought to just get rid of the idea or the notion of human rights. Rather, what we ought to insist upon is the notion of what he calls civil liberties. Civil liberties. Civil liberties and human rights are two different things. Civil liberties are those freedoms that we recognize that would promote the greatest good for the greatest number. Human rights are freedoms. A human right we could define as a claim that we have on others that includes a freedom for ourselves. So the two things are different. Human rights say, look, don't violate these or it is immoral. Civil liberties say, if these provide the greatest good for the greatest number, then we'll follow them. But if they don't, then it's time to get rid of them. So one could think of a situation wherein freedom of speech does not provide the greatest good for the greatest number, so we'll just hamper that freedom of speech. For unalienable rights. Now, where this becomes a problem in practice is that we can always justify then doing whatever we want to, causing any amount of pain to the minority, so long as it creates a greater good for the majority. Case in point, historically in the United States, would be the issue of slavery. Because in the days where slavery was legal and where they were engaging in the battle to make it illegal, during that whole course of American history, what ended up happening is that you see people in the South who were pro-slavery who were making utilitarian arguments for keeping slavery legal. They would say things like, what would happen if we freed all the slaves right now, what that would do to the economy of the South? Do you know what that would do to our agriculture? And even people in the North wouldn't have any food then. And by the way, it wouldn't help the slaves any, because if they had their freedom, but there wasn't any food for them to eat, then it's going to hurt them too. So it's going to produce the greatest good for the greatest number if we simply keep slavery legal and regulate it. That's how it was regulated and kept legal for so long. Well, no, I don't think there's anybody alive today. Well, there probably is someone, but the vast majority of us, I think, are of the agreement that we don't believe that human beings should be slaves, in particular, especially if that slavery is done on the basis of something like ethnicity. Now, if somebody wanted to sell themselves into slavery and they had a choice in the matter, that might be something different. That would be more like a contract worker anyway, but sort of. But we could see, okay, maybe that could be justifiable, but never kidnapping somebody and forcing them on the basis of just the color of their skin or something of that nature to serve us for nothing, for the entirety of their life. That's wicked. But under utilitarianism, the reason we would say that slavery is wicked normally, not under utilitarianism, but normally, is because we would say that it violates human rights, that these people, the people that are slaves, that they deserve their freedom, and we are violating human rights. Well, utilitarianism says if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number to treat people like this, then maybe we should consider it. So there's no basis for unalienable rights. It can be used to justify, utilitarianism can be used to justify pretty much anything, so long as we can make the argument that to do this thing would promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So yeah, utilitarianism is sort of a default position almost in our culture. However, it's one that's not critically examined so much. And I think that there are some serious issues with it, as we've seen. Well, we will see in the next video. We're going to move from consequentialist ethics to deontological ethics, and we'll see that in the next video. But until then, have a great time. Bye-bye.